Again, the leading Whigs are William Henry Harrison and Daniel Webster. Remember, Daniel Webster has this 9-day debate earlier about the prominence of the Union and the need to keep it together against nullification from South Carolina. So again, the Whigs try to split the vote, so they win the majority. Doesn't really work out for them. On the Democratic side, we have the handpicked successor of Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren. He's his chosen man. It's a very close popular vote, but a big win for Van Buren in the Electoral College. We've got a ratio of 170 to 124. And so we have sort of Jacksonian democracy sort of continuing after Jackson's gone. So what was the good done by Andrew Jackson? He increased power of the executive. We talked about the vetoes that he did, vetoing the Bank of the United States, also using the power of the spoils system, also known as patronage, where a president is going to be able to choose his cabinet members and his advisors and prominent positions in Washington, so that things run smoothly. People like Thomas Jefferson did not have the spoils system. He also is going to lead the common man into national politics because of, I don't know if it's because of him, but because of the corrupt bargain of 1824 and John Quincy Adams. There's going to be more voting participation. He's going to support the people. He's going to support states' rights. A lot of the things that he did were for the people. He did understand that keeping the Union together was paramount, but he did also work for states' rights. Some of the bills he vetoed, we talked about earlier, the highway bill that would create a national highway was supposed to be paid for through the national government, and he vetoed that, saying that it gave the federal government too much power. As far as the Native Americans went, he supported Georgia in its fight against the national government with the Indian Removal Act of 1830. The common man supported Andrew Jackson. He was against secession, against nullification, which could be seen as something that people wanted, but I think if you really look at it, it's really just a real small segment of the population. But again, these are things that Andrew Jackson is going to be doing well for the people. He unites the common people into one Democratic Party. Of course, after 1824, it splits. So some splits don't ever work out. We have parties that kind of fall by the wayside. The Democratic Party is seen strong because of Jackson's leadership. And the people finally proved that they can be trusted with the vote. Remember, after 1824, there's a big advancement in the number of people participating in voting, primarily because they're interested, because the candidates have actual platforms. They're known nationally, their platforms through the press, and also that the idea of having property be a requirement for suffrage kind of goes away. So these are all reasons for increased vote. And again, people just liked Andrew Jackson. Okay, the bad by Andrew Jackson. He did encourage the spoils system. Yes, it increased his power, but in a kind of a bad way. Favoritism, nepotism, these are all things that happen because of the spoils system. Who should get the jobs in Washington is the most qualified, and not necessarily friends and supporters of the candidate. So this is something that's going to be a big problem. James Garfield, excuse me. James Garfield is going to hate the spoils system for a very specific reason. You'll find that out later. Native Americans, again, sounds like a noble cause. Him wanting to move the Native Americans off the land so they can be civilized properly. But in essence, we're really moving Native Americans from their ancestral homelands for thousands of years. And not to say Andrew Jackson is chickening out here, but he really doesn't force the Native Americans away himself during his presidency. That's left to his successor, Martin Van Buren. So Native Americans, their treatment obviously very bad. Seminole War, Indian Removal Act, all those things. And of course, when he gets rid of the Bank of the United States, for what he thinks are good reasons, that's going to end up having a recession. And you're going to hear about that next when we talk about Martin Van Buren. So speaking of Martin Van Buren, okay, his nickname was the Wizard of Albany. Prior to his political career, he was very successful at managing the political careers of others. He was a very successful attorney, and then, of course, went on to manage his own career. Another nickname for him was the Red Fox. Big shoes to fill, wasn't nearly as popular as Andrew Jackson. One of his other nicknames was Little Magician. He was 5'6", very crafty politician. There's a picture of old Martin Van Buren. Okay. There were problems on the border with Canada. Where exactly was the border with Canada? We'll talk about that a little bit later. Anti-slavery issues with Texas. Again, that's the whole issue why Texas wasn't admitted right away. It's going to cause an imbalance of power in Washington. And of course, the biggest thing, excuse me for not hitting these bullets, the biggest thing is the Depression caused by Andrew Jackson killing the Bank of the United States. He kills the banks. Again, private banks are going to sort of take over. He warned that because of a stable national bank, private banks would take more risk. Ironically, though, private banks take more risk after the Bank of the United States is gone. So it's interesting how he warned against it, and it happened anyway. With the stability of the banks, maybe he was just erroneous. Maybe with the stability of the Bank of the United States, we might not have had banks taking these enormous risks. And we're going to talk about this in just a second. So Panic of 1837, consider it sort of a mini Great Depression. Depression because of over speculation and the bank war. People wanted to keep the bank. Jackson vetoed the bank. Again, that's the bank war. It resulted in all state banks. Remember that Jackson took the money out of the federal banks, put them in pet banks. As far as over speculation goes, this is very similar to what happens in the Great Depression. There were no rules on state banks. And so banks were giving out tons of money, tons of loans to investors to go invest in new technologies and buy land that was available because of Louisiana Purchase and local land that was still available in the Northeast area. And people were sort of investing this as a gamble. Okay, that's really what you're doing when you speculate. You borrow money from a bank, go invest in something you think is going to do well. And when it doesn't do well, you lose money. And of course, now you still owe the bank. And so a lot of other things happen to cause this depression as well. Customs revenue is going to go down. We're going to lose money because the tariffs are going down. The sale of land is also going to decline. We're going to have lots of crop failures, business failures. And because of all these things, because especially of over speculation, a lot of banks are going to fall. And all this happens even before Van Buren takes office. It happens before Andrew Jackson leaves office. One of the things that happens right before Van Buren takes over is there's a lot of inflation. And so Andrew Jackson tries to combat inflation, and he's going to try to increase the value of money. And so for land purchases, he's going to require that all land purchases be paid with silver and gold, which will cause the paper money, the greenbacks, to sort of lower their radically inflationary rates. And what this is called, it's called the Specie Circular, SPECIE circular, this idea that the government requires gold and silver to be used to buy land. It doesn't work out too well. And again, this leads to a collapse in the money system, overinflation. Again, and if you couple that with the bank war, couple that with over speculation, you've got a recession on your hands, and that's what Martin Van Buren has. So the Whigs, what are they going to do about this? The Democrats have failed them. They're now in a recession. What do you do? Okay, so the Whigs have ideas. First of all, let's expand bank credit. Let's strengthen the banks and give the banks a little more power. Obviously, regulate the banks, give them some more credit, a safe credit to give out, and increase spending to strengthen the economy. That's what you do. When your economy stalls, you get people to spend money. That's the idea, sort of like a stimulus package from the Whigs. Going back to increasing tariffs. Well, obviously we know who that's going to make extremely upset, the South and the West. This is their idea, though. Subsidizing internal improvements. Getting private businesses to help with internal improvements as well as the federal government, not just making it the federal government's responsibility. Martin Van Buren, though, like Andrew Jackson, wants the government out of the economy. So he wants sort of a laissez-faire approach. That term laissez-faire, hands off. Martin Van Buren does not want to interfere with the economy. He wants the economy to run itself. Supply and demand should determine the market. And so their idea was to create an independent treasury. And this independent treasury is sort of like a private treasury, not really under the government's purview. Money would be stored in various places. And this idea is called a divorce bill. Basically, it divorces the federal government from the responsibilities of the treasury. It was passed in 1840 and then repealed Didn't really work out too well. Later on, this idea of an independent treasury that's not under direct control of the executive branch becomes part of the Federal Reserve in 1913. So it's going to work out then. It's not really working out in the 1840s. Okay, speaking of the 1840s, here's the election of 1840. Again, Van Buren is sort of dealing with an economic crisis throughout his entire presidency. The Democrats still support him. The Whigs are going to nominate William Henry Harrison. The Democrats didn't really have another choice. He's the president. Okay. The Whigs the same way. I mean, no time in history has a party not nominated the current standing president. And as far as the Whigs go, there's not a lot of options as well. And the big thing is that the Whigs want someone they can control. William Henry Harrison is seen as a puppet. Henry Clay and Daniel Webster are Whigs. They're much better candidates, but they're not sort of as controllable as a William Henry Harrison will be. William Henry Harrison was very popular. His tendencies were unknown to most voters. And so a lot of Americans didn't know his policies, didn't know his platforms. So he's seen as sort of a common man. There wasn't anything that William Henry Harrison had done before that would exclude any voters. And so to some, that was very appealing. So when William Henry Harrison, has the theme of log cabin, okay? And he doesn't take this theme. He gets this theme from the Democrats. The Democrats characterize William Henry Harrison as sort of being a poor old farmer who would be as content being the president as if he were living in a log cabin and had a barrel of hard cider. So we get this idea of the log cabin theme. And what the Democrats don't realize is this derogatory way of characterizing Harrison actually gets flipped on him. Because Harrison runs with this idea of the log cabin theme, Democrats poking fun at him, the masses, the people actually support this. They see this as sort of, hey, he's kind of like me. He's an old farmer. He's happy just hanging out at his house, drinking hard cider. And so it becomes sort of a rallying cry for him, and it gets the support of the masses. So it's kind of a dumb thing of the Democrats to poke fun at him before realizing that the one thing they're making fun of is going to be the political base that's going to help him win the election. So his vice president is John Tyler. John Tyler is going to be a former Democrat from Virginia. Also, William Henry Harrison was at the Battle of Tippecanoe in the War of 1812. He was a hero of that. John Tyler, on the other hand, is sort of the balancing part of this nomination, this ticket. Tyler is an old Democrat Republican. He's meant to be there to sort of appease the Southerners who were against sort of the radical ideas of Clay and Webster. And again, it's a balanced team. And so we have the election of Harrison and Tyler. And so good job, Harrison. You're now president. 31 days later, you're dead. Okay. So William Henry Harrison lasts in office for about 31 days. He dies of typhoid fever. And of course, then John Tyler takes over. He's the first president ever to be elected or actually placed as president, not elected, after the death of a president. And we're going to have a few of these in the future. So it's going to be a trend. So why did the Whigs win? The Whigs won because there was no platform. Again, they also won because the Democrats kind of gave them the platform when they made fun of William Henry Harrison. They also won because of the depression under Martin Van Buren. The Democrats were blamed for that. And again, Whigs were seen as advocates of positive government, more intervention, more ways of helping everyone. So the vote, fairly close, popular vote. The electoral vote was not even close, 234 to 60 electoral votes. And last but not least, let's talk about Andrew Jackson. What's the legacy of Andrew Jackson? Well, he's going to really help formulate a very strong and lasting two-party system. Again, the National Republicans and the Democrats. The Jacksonian Democrats are going to focus on liberties of individuals, not just government privileges, states' rights, federal restraint. We talked about some of the states' rights earlier that Jackson defended. Infrastructure being too powerful a thing to be left in the hands of the federal government. Native Americans, states should have the right to determine what happens to Native Americans. Federal banks, why should there be a state supported not state supported. Why should there be a federally supported national bank? That's giving too much power to the rich, too much foreign influence, lots of things that Jackson defended. But again, always remember that Jackson is going to be against nullification and be a staunch advocate of keeping the Union together. So the Whigs, they're going to use the government to realize their objectives. They're going to try to renew the national bank, renew protective tariffs, internal improvements through different means than other presidents have done, improve public schools, and they're going to start working on temperance, reforming liquor. We're going to see the temperance movement kind of start, mainly from women, and then we're going to work on abolition. So you see sort of the reformative attitude of the Whigs. So what do historians think about this whole Jacksonian democracy thing? Okay, well, Arthur Schlesinger, he writes a book called The Age of Jackson in 1945, and he says it's not really a sectional conflict between the North and the South. It's really more of a class conflict. It's really more about farmers and laborers kind of versus the entire business community. A lot of these things that happen are because of how the economy affects different parts of the United States, different occupations, excuse me. So again, the second bank in the United States was an argument about who is it helping? Who is it unfairly helping? Who is it hurting? It was about helping manufacturing. It was about hurting farmers. And so again, this idea of Jackson and his idea of Jacksonian democracy, they think this whole Jacksonian era is about sort of anti-capitalism, as far as the rich shouldn't benefit from capitalism only. It should benefit everyone. So everything should be fair. And of course, this is going to lead to other reforms and other ways of government regulation, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Okay. Hey, Arthur, how you doing? Richard Hofstadter has another idea in 1948. He says that this time represents the rejection of capitalism, that there's not a rejection of capitalism, but a desire for entrepreneurs to secure laissez-faire policies that would serve their own interest. And so he disagrees. He says that, entrepreneurs are going to want lack of regulation so that they can become rich. But again, this whole idea is that everyone should benefit from capitalism, the whole idea of market economy, the whole idea of no national bank. We're trying to make things fair. And so this is kind of the theme that Hofstadter says. So it's a great time for the economy. It's not a runaway for big businessmen. We're not going to have the monopolists that we have at sort of the end of the 19th century. We get into Rockefeller and Carnegie and JP Morgan and those guys. But it is a good time for the economy. It's just they're trying to make it fair for everyone. Okay, last person to talk about, Frederick Jackson Turner. His idea of this Jacksonian democracy is the idea that the frontier, the West, sort of represents part of the American identity. And democracy really was symbolized by the Western frontier. It's kind of an interesting idea. It's like, what does the West mean, man? Well, the West is sort of, it's freedom, it's liberty, okay? The East has long since been monopolized by the remnants of what came over from England, this aristocracy, this rich, wealthy class. So the economy in the West and the social structure, the economy in the East and the social structure in the East is sort of already, set in stone. But the West is open, it's free. So pure democracy, pure freedom is symbolized from this open West area. People can go West, they can make their fortune. Ideas like manifest destiny, ideas like the American dream are sort of popping up. And that's the idea here, that democracy really is symbolized by the West. So kind of an interesting idea, if you like that kind of thing. What does the West mean, man? It means democracy, man. Well, that's kind of an interesting idea. I think it's a valid one. Okay. And then finally, here's a picture of Frederick Jackson Turner. It's a sweet mustache. Thank you, guys. Deuces.